On April 18, 1942, the U.S. launched a bombing raid on Tokyo. It was in retaliation for Pearl Harbor and a morale booster for Americans, but it was an incredibly risky mission. It was the first time heavily loaded bombers had taken off from a Navy carrier. The raid was successful, and though it caused little damage, it frightened the Japanese because they did not know where the planes had come from to attack mainland Japan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese fleet, wanted to ensure that such a raid could never happen again. He ordered a huge force of 185 ships, 5,000 troops, and 280 planes to take Midway Island, the farthest U.S. outpost in the Pacific. Midway Island is located in the middle of the Pacific, almost precisely halfway between the United States and Japan. It is just large enough to hold a landing strip and a small bay. The Japanese thought that taking the island would be easy with their huge fleet, but they were counting on their attack being a total surprise. It turned out that American intelligence had decoded messages and learned of the Midway attack. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, immediately ordered 3 carriers sent from Pearl Harbor to a rendezvous point north of Midway, where he thought the ships would not be discovered by the Japanese. The success of the outnumbered U.S. forces would be entirely based on whether they could find the Japanese before the Japanese could find them. Japan sent 4 aircraft carriers to Midway: the Akagi, the Hiro, the Kaga, and the Soru. On these ships were 106 Zero fighters, 93 Kate bombers, and 72 Val dive bombers. The fleet also consisted of 7 battleships, 14 cruisers, 15 submarines, 42 destroyers, and over 30 supporting ships, including transports with 5,000 troops. America sent 3 carriers: the Yorktown, the Hornet, and the Enterprise. These ships were protected by 8 cruisers and 16 destroyers. The carriers supported 234 fighters and bombers, while the Midway base supported another 126 planes, including fighters, bombers, scouts, and flying fortresses. The main American planes used were the Wildcat fighter, the Dauntless dive bomber, the Avenger torpedo bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress, and the Catalina flying boat, a scout plane. The Battle of Midway started June 4, 1942, at 4:30 in the morning, when the Japanese carriers launched 108 warplanes to attack the U.S. base at Midway. While Japanese planes flew the 2-hour trip to Midway, the Japanese fleet continued to advance toward the island. Meanwhile, the U.S. fleet was moving towards their rendezvous point, nicknamed Point Luck. When the Japanese planes neared Midway, they were attacked by U.S. fighters. The U.S. planes, though, were outclassed and were easily defeated. The Japanese then moved on to bomb Midway Island. Their attack was blunted by heavy anti-aircraft fire from the base. Before the Japanese had arrived to bomb the Midway base, Midway's radar and scout planes had reported the attacking Japanese. Most of the base's planes had taken off and scattered to avoid being hit by the bombs while on the ground. Also, an attack force of 51 Midway planes, including 6 TBF Avenger bombers, had set out to attack the Japanese fleet. When the attack planes from Midway arrived at the Japanese fleet, they were immediately attacked by Zero fighters. The U.S. planes scored no hits and pulled out with heavy losses. Only 1 of the Avenger bombers and 2 B-26s returned to the base. Back at the Midway base, after the blunted attack, the Japanese leader of the raid radioed back to his fleet that another attack wave was needed. On the carriers, Japanese planes readied for another bombing of the Midway base. Meanwhile, the U.S. ships had converged at Point Luck and launched warplanes to attack the Japanese carriers. The Japanese were still unaware that there were any U.S. carriers in the area. A Japanese scout plane, though, had just spotted 10 U.S. ships, including a carrier. The pilot radioed back to the Japanese fleet, who prepared for an attack on U.S. carriers instead of another attack on the ground base. But while Japanese planes sat on the carrier's decks being reloaded, a squadron of torpedo bombers from the Hornet appeared. More and more bombers came, and most were shot down by anti-aircraft guns or zero fighters. By the time they had finished their offensive, only 4 of the 41 Devastators were remaining, and no torpedoes had hit an enemy ship. But the Devastators' attack had indirectly helped the U.S. offensive. The low-flying planes had kept the defending Japanese anti-aircraft and fighter crews busy, while, high above, dive bombers had arrived unnoticed and unchallenged. One squadron of dauntless dive bombers dived on the Kaga. Another dived on the Akagi. 17 more dive bombers arrived from the Yorktown and dived on the Soru. Over 6 minutes, all 3 carriers were fatally ablaze. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiru, unharmed by the dive bomber raid, immediately launched 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighter escorts. They headed for the Yorktown. When they reached the U.S. carrier, they were attacked by U.S. fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Fighters shot down 10 Vals, and the anti-aircraft fire stopped 2 more. But the planes dropped bombs that hit the carrier. One hit the flight deck, where shrapnel started off fire. One knocked out 5 of the ship's boilers, slowing it down. Crew were able to put out the fires and temporarily save the ship. But in the next attack, bombers dropped 2 torpedoes, which tore open the side of the ship. The Yorktown did not sink, though. A salvage operation began, and soon a tugboat would start to pull it back to Pearl Harbor. While the Yorktown was being evacuated, the Enterprise launched 24 dauntless dive bombers to attack the 4th Japanese carrier, Hiru, which had just been spotted 100 miles to the northwest. It soon joined the other Japanese carriers as a helpless victim of the dive. The Japanese suffered heavy losses at the Battle of Midway. All 4 of the Japanese carriers and 1 cruiser were sunk by dive bombers. Because of sunken carriers, only 24 of the 280 planes survived. The total loss of life for the Japanese was 3,052 men. The Japanese Navy would never again launch an offensive. The U.S. suffered far fewer losses in the way of men. The battle cost 362 American lives. The carrier Yorktown was lost because it was torpedoed while being pulled back to Pearl Harbor. The destroyer Hammond was also sunk, and 143 of the 360 aircraft were destroyed. The Battle of Midway, though fought over a tiny naval base, proved to be the turning point of the war in the Pacific. It was the largest defeat suffered by the Japanese Navy in 350 years. Japan had risked everything in order to cripple the U.S. Navy, and in doing so, crippled itself.